On behalf of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, thank you for joining us for our community meeting regarding the amendment to the Order on Consent for Interim Response Action for the Radioactive Materials Handling Facility at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. We are here today because during our last community meeting on June 11th, we indicated that we would keep you informed about our progress on site and host a community meeting for any milestone activities. Please note that this is DTSC's first community Zoom webinar, and we would like to thank you in advance for your patience if we experience any technical difficulties. If you experience any technical difficulties during the meeting, we ask that you dial in again or use the link provided in the invitation you were sent. Meeting agreements. By participating in this meeting, you understand that the meeting is being recorded, may be muted and or escorted off of the meeting, background noise, going over time, using profanity, or being discourteous to your fellow participants or presenters. As we are not in a formal comment period, we will answer questions related to the presentation. You may share your comments with DTSC. They will not be formally addressed. Thank you again for your patience and understanding. Our agenda for tonight includes a brief presentation that provides an overview of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, a status update regarding the Order on Consent for Interim Response Action for the Radioactive Materials Handling Facility, which will also be referred to as the RMHF, and an overview of the amendment to the Order on Consent. Our presenters for this evening are Steve Becker, the branch chief for the Santa Susana Field Laboratory and the Lead Acid Battery Recycling Facility Investigation and Cleanup Program. That's also known as LABRIC. Laura Rainey will also be speaking this evening. She is DTSC's Santa Susana Field Laboratory Project Manager who oversees the activities of the Department of Energy. Majority of the evening's meeting will consist of questions and answers, and they should be focused on tonight's presentation and the amendment to the Order on Consent. We're going to conclude with a very brief wrap-up. Please note that there are going to be 3 ways that you can participate in asking questions this evening. First, if you have joined us via telephone, we are going to read off the last 3 digits of your telephone number. When you hear the last 3 digits of your telephone number, please press *6 to unmute yourself. State your name and ask the question. If you have joined us via Zoom, you may need to hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen and a toolbar will appear. There you will see a Q&A or a raised hand. You may see both. That gives you an option. If you'd like to hear the question read aloud and answered, type your question in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. If you would like to ask the question directly, please use the raised hand feature. If you do choose the raised hand feature, once you're called upon, please unmute yourself. State your name and ask your question. Each member of the community will have 2 minutes to speak, and that is a maximum of two minutes in order to get your question answered. So please remain muted if you're not speaking. So again, to be clear, to ask your question, you have up to a maximum of 2 minutes, and we ask that you please remain muted if you're not speaking. Next slide, please. So what is the Department of Toxic Substances Control? What do we do? What is our mission? DTSC is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and we regulate the storage and handling of hazardous waste materials and oversee cleanup projects. The mission of DTSC is to protect California's people and environment from harmful effects of toxic substances by restoring contaminated resources, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. At this time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our first presenter, DTSC's Santa Susana Field Laboratory and Labrick Branch Chief, Steve Becker. Steve?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Becker. I'm the branch chief for the DTSC SSFL team. If we could please advance to the next slide. To provide an overview of the site, the Santa Susana Field Laboratory is an approximately 2,850 acre site where rocket testing and nuclear research took place. As shown on the current slide, the outer portion of the yellow boundary is actually the site boundary. The internal boundaries differentiate the different sub-areas within the site. Testing and maintenance operations at the site resulted in releases of contamination to both soil and groundwater. The primary contaminants at the site include a variety of solvents, primarily trichloroethylene, metals, and petroleum hydrocarbons. There were also releases of radionuclides associated with nuclear research activities. The primary objectives of cleanups conducted by DTSC are to protect human health and the environment. To accomplish this, DTSC requires cleanup plans that, number one, control sources of releases, and two, achieve soil and groundwater cleanup standards. Implementation of the SSFL cleanup is being conducted under the 2007 consent order and 2010 administrative orders on consent, also referred to as the AOCs. Cleanup at the site must comply with applicable, relevant, and appropriate laws, regulations, and requirements. And so now to talk a little bit about soil cleanup at the site and what mechanisms it's conducted under. So for the 2007 consent order, this identifies the soil cleanup requirements for the Boeing company. For the 2010 administrative orders on consent, this dictates the requirements for soil cleanup for both NASA and the Department of Energy. Now for groundwater cleanup, all cleanup is dictated by the 2007 consent order. And so this would cover the Boeing company, NASA, as well as the Department of Energy. If we could please click forward one tap to show a little bit of animation. So this is the radioactive materials handling facility. And it's a photograph in kind of the center, upper center portion of the current slide. This is where the activities have been conducted to date under the original RMHF order, interim response order. So if we could do one more click. So this slide shows the remaining 10 buildings within Area 4 that will be dealt with under the amendment to the RMH order, which will be discussed later in the presentation by my colleague, Nora Rainey. So if we could go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the order on consent for the radioactive materials handling facility. That order outlined the interim response action for the RMHF complex. It also covered building demolition and debris disposal. It required off-site disposal at an authorized or licensed commercial low-level mixed or mixed low-level radioactive waste disposal facility. It also authorized the removal of above-ground portions of the structures. It required that asphalt, concrete slabs, and foundations be left in place to provide a barrier to the soil below them and/or subsurface structures. Next slide, please. If we could slowly advance through and click through, you'll start to see the buildings as they were from an oblique angle, an aerial angle, and then you'll see the little bubbles that emanate from them show the structure once it was reduced down to basically on grade. So they were taken down to the slab. So you'll see buildings 4621, 4020, 4658, 4075, and 4563. 4665, 4044, 4688, and 4022. This slide shows the 10 buildings prior to and following demolition to a slab on grade condition. We can advance to the next slide, please. So this slide shows a little bit about the status of the interim response action at the RMHF complex. It shows some of the activities while they were actually occurring. So on the previous slide, you actually had an opportunity to see all the buildings after they were removed to a slab on grade situation. If you look at the photograph on the far left of the slide, it shows the remaining concrete slab after the demolition of building 4021. Behind that was a large tall stack and building 4022, which are shown in the background, and those have at this point been demolished and removed. The second slide, or second photograph in the middle, shows them setting up the crane with a tether for lowering down the stack to the ground, as well as removing the trusses for building 4022, which were lowered to the ground and then lowered up or lowered into trucks for disposal off-site. The third photograph shows a picture of one of the trucks when it was loaded up with bins ready for off-site transport, with markings identifying the bin number, the manifest number, the weight, and the waste classification and UN number. And so with that, to talk a little bit more about the amendment to the order, I will pass it on to my colleague, Laura Rainey.
Hi, thank you, Steve. Good evening. My name's Laura Rainey, and I'm the DTSC SSFL project manager. I oversee the activities of the Department of Energy. Fire statistics show, as you can see on the slide, fires continue to be an issue, a significant issue. Similar to the RMHF, there's also a need to address the remaining DOE buildings in Area 4. The photo that you can see on this slide shows the extent, that's in the red hash area, shows the extent of the Woolsey fire within Area 4 with respect to the buildings that remain in Area 4. If we could click on the aerial photo, right now it shows the RMHF complex. That's what Steve's been talking about. Those buildings at this point have been demolished. This new label showing up here is now the Hazardous Waste Management Facility buildings. It's made up of two buildings about 1,300 feet apart. It's building 4133 and 4029. And if you can click again, the amendment to the order not only covers the HWMF buildings, those two buildings, but there's 6 additional DOE-owned buildings that remain in Area 4, and those are also shown on this photo. Now, you've just heard Steve explain what the amendment to the order is and that it requires an interim response action. An interim response action, that's a course of action taken prior to implementation of a cleanup remedy to reduce further migration of the contaminants into the environment. It's also intended to reduce or eliminate the concentration of contaminants at a source area and eliminate exposure pathways. Interim response action required by the order and its amendment is a very focused scope that is demolition, removal, and off-site disposal of above-ground structures associated with these 8 remaining DOE buildings in Area 4. Interim response action will be conducted by the United States Department of Energy, you'll hear us refer to as DOE, under the oversight of the Department of Toxic Substances Control. In the event of a fire followed by heavy rain, the deteriorating buildings could potentially release contamination that could migrate off-site. A release of the hazardous substances from this area may present a danger to the public health or to the environment. Removal of these buildings will eliminate the above-ground source of contaminants, that's the buildings, thus will eliminate the potential for exposure to the contaminants. This action will also remove the risk to the site workers of debris that may potentially fall during high winds from the partially demolished buildings that are structurally unsound. Amendment to the order allows for completion of the above-ground demolition of all the remaining DOE-owned structures in Area 4. The scope of this interim action is focused on removal of the above-ground structures that may be burned by wildfire. To be clear, this is not a full cleanup. No ground disturbance will occur. The below-ground structures associated with these buildings will remain in place for future removal when the soils cleanup occurs. This interim response action addresses the risk of potential The risk of potential offsite contamination from future wildfires by requiring removal and offsite disposal of these buildings. Cleanup at the remaining DOE-owned buildings in Area 4 will occur in 3 phases. Phase 1 is the interim response action we're discussing tonight, and will be demolition and removal of the above-ground portions of the structures. Phase 2 will involve removal and disposal of the surface asphalt, concrete, and below-ground portions of the buildings. Phase 3 will occur when soil cleanup occurs and will involve characterization and disposal of impacted soil. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so there are 2 types of DOE-owned buildings remaining in Area 4. There are 2 RCRA permitted buildings that are undergoing RCRA closure, and these are the hazardous waste management facility buildings we spoke about on the previous slide. There are the 6 non-RCRA permitted buildings. Prior to demolition, all buildings will have undergone removal of hazardous constituents. These materials include asbestos-containing materials, lead-based paints, fluorescent tubes, batteries, lamp ballast, capacitors, and other regulated materials. Following the same disposal requirements that were applicable to the RMHF, all waste generated at the buildings will be disposed of off-site out of the state of California at a licensed or authorized commercial low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste disposal facility in a manner that's protective of human health and the environment. Disposal will meet the waste acceptance criteria for the receiving facility, will follow the waste disposition pathways described in the Administrative Order on Consents Agreement in Principle. This is the same process that was applied for disposal of the RMHF demolition debris. RCRA wastes have been removed from the buildings. Remaining non-RCRA hazardous and potentially hazardous materials to be removed during demolition will also be disposed of at a licensed or authorized commercial low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste facility outside of the state of California. During demolition, the above-ground portions of the structures will be removed, but the slabs and the foundations will be left in place to provide a barrier to the soil or subsurface structures. If the buildings have below-ground structures, the below-ground foundation and walls will be left in place. Asphalt surfaces will also be left in place. During demolition, dust control and dust protection measures will be employed to mitigate the generation of dust. Dust control measures such as pre-watering of the building exterior and misting will be used during demolition to reduce generated dust sources. Dust management practices, controls, and measures will be employed during and after demolition for control of stormwater runoff and non-stormwater runoff. Pre- and post-demolition inspections will identify and appropriately address issues such as the potential for water intrusion and fixed contamination remaining on the slab is exposed to the weather. If contamination remains on the slab and is not removable, a suitable material to prevent water accumulation on the slab will be added after demolition. Additionally, all penetrations, vaults, and entries to basements will be sealed and protected to prevent water intrusion. Any slabs with detectable radioactivity above background following building demolition will have shielding in place to ensure that the former building areas are left in a condition that's protective of human health and the environment. A combination of shielding and administrative or institutional controls will be used to ensure that the workers and members of the public do not receive exposures above background levels. There will be plans, these will be DTSC approved plans, describing the interim response action, the RCRA Hazardous Waste Management Facility buildings 4029 and 4133. These plans include RCRA closure plan, a standardized operating procedure for phase 1 of demolition of the facilities at HWMF. I'll refer to that as the SOP. And there'll also be an HWMF building demolition plan. For the remaining 6 DOE Area 4 buildings, demolition and disposal will be conducted following a DTSC approved combined demolition plan and SOP that is specific to those 6 buildings. The order and the amendment cover and include building demolition and disposal of the building debris. It doesn't apply to the soil cleanup activities at SSFL pursuant to the Administrative Order on Consent signed by DTSC and DOE in 2010, or to groundwater. However, removal of these features is necessary to inspect, screen, and or sample the soil directly beneath the facilities to comply with the AOC. Under the amendment to the order, DOE will conduct building demolition activities under DTSC oversight and will dispose of the resulting building demolition debris offsite out of the state of California, a licensed or authorized commercial low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste disposal facility in a manner that's protective of human health and the environment. At the completion of this interim action, no above-ground buildings or debris will remain. DTSC is committed to ensuring that the former DOE Area 4 building locations be left in a condition that's protective of human health and the environment until the next phase of below-ground cleanup occurs. The DOE Area 4 buildings shown on this photo include the RMHF complex, which you've heard about, the status of demolition under the order. It also shows the RCRA permitted HWMF buildings we've been discussing. That's buildings 4029, known as the Reactive Metals Storage Yard, and building 4133, which is the Hazardous Waste Treatment Facility. As I said, those buildings, they're about 1,300 feet apart, and collectively together, they make up the HWMF RCRA permitted facility. There's also building 4019, the Systems for Nuclear Auxiliary Power, known as SNAP. The Criticality Test Facility is another name for that building. Building 4024 is the SNAP Reactor Environmental Test Facility. Building 4038 is the Energy Technology Engineering Center, otherwise known as ETEC. This is the office building. Building 4057 is the Sodium Test Rig Facility. Building 4462 is the Sodium Pump Test Facility, and Building 4463, which is adjacent, is the Sodium Pump Test Facility, Pump and Mechanical Parts Cleaning Facility. There are additional buildings in this photo that are not DOE-owned buildings, and these are Boeing buildings. Those buildings include, although they're not numbered, but I'll read off the names and the numbers to you. There's building 4009, known as the Organic Moderated Reactor Criticality Facility, and Sodium Graphite Reactor Critical Facility. There's also building 4100, the former Criticality Test Facility, otherwise known as the Advanced Epithermal Thorium Reactor, and Radiation Safety and Computed Tomography. There's building 4055, which is the Nuclear Material Development Lab and Plutonium Development Facility. There's building 4005, which is only the slab remaining. It was known as the Uranium Carbide Fuel Pilot Plant. Building 4011, which is only the low bay remaining, is the Administrative Services Building, Manufacturing and Development, Support Shop, Machine Shop, and Radiation Instrument Calibration Laboratory. You can tell from the names of these buildings, they have a history of radiologic use. Some of the buildings appear on this photo that have since been demolished. These buildings include Building 4006, which was the non-nuclear sodium laboratory, and Building 4015, which was the warehouse. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as discussed during the previous slide, the amendment to the order authorizes the removal of the 8 remaining DOE-owned buildings in Area 4 that are listed here. Of these buildings, 4 have a history of radiologic use. Again, that's Building 4019, 4024, 4029, and 4133. These buildings' debris will be disposed of following the same procedures that the RMHF debris underwent. Disposal of these buildings' debris will be to a licensed commercial mixed low-level radioactive waste facility outside of California. The term mixed low-level radioactive waste means waste with both a chemical component and a radiological component. It's important to note that requirements that were applicable for disposal of the RMHF debris are also applicable for disposal of demolition debris from the remaining DOE buildings in Area 4. Demolition and disposal of all waste will be in accordance with the waste acceptance criteria of the receiving facility, and will also be consistent with the waste requirements described in the 2010 Administrative Order on Consents Agreement in Principle. The other 4 DOE-owned buildings in Area 4, that's buildings 4038, 4057, and 4462, and 4463, these don't have a history of radiologic use. However, many public comments received expressed concern over disposal of building demolition debris from Area 4 to landfills in California that are not licensed to receive low-level radioactive waste. In abundance of caution and in consideration of the public comments received, building demolition debris from these buildings will also be disposed of out of the state of California to an authorized mixed low-level radioactive waste facility. Rather than sending an industrial waste or hazardous waste to an in-state permitted hazardous waste landfill, this waste will go out of the state to a low-level radioactive waste facility that has a permitted landfill that's authorized to receive the waste. Again, demolition and disposal of all waste from these buildings will be in accordance with the waste acceptance criteria of the receiving facility. It will also be conducted in a manner consistent with the waste disposal requirements described in the AOC's agreement in principle. Next slide, please. So now we have the schedule for the amendment to the order on consent. The order itself, the original order, was signed on May 19, 2020. And the amendment to that order was signed on October 30th, 2020. The order and its amendment requires DTSC to review and approve plans associated with the interim response action. DTSC has reviewed and approved the following plans: the HWMF SOP for phase 1 demolition of the facilities, also the demolition plan for phase 1 of demolition at HWMF. And it's also approved the RCRA closure plan for the HWMF, and that's for full closure for all 3 phases for the closure of RCRA. Review of the combined demolition plan and SOP for the remaining DOE Area 4 buildings is in progress. DTSC approval must be obtained prior to beginning demolition. Deactivation of the buildings is currently in progress. Demolition of the HWMF buildings will be conducted first and is anticipated to start in November 2020. At the completion of phase 1, post-demolition inspections will be conducted and the site will be placed in an interim site configuration protective of human health and the environment and will result in no exposure to the public of radioactivity above background. Interim status configuration will be maintained until the remainder of the below ground structures are removed when soil cleanup occurs. Amendment to the order requires an evaluation of the site be performed 1 year from the completion of demolition. Findings will be submitted for the annual evaluation of the performance of the site restorative measures for the building demolition sites. In all, the demolition activities for the remaining DOE Area 4 buildings are estimated for completion by September of 2021. DTSC, as you can hear from these activities we described tonight, DTSC is committed to ensuring that the demolition activities are conducted in a manner that's protective of the Area 4 environment and to the neighboring communities. I'd like to thank you for your time. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you also, Steve. We have heard a tremendous amount of information this evening that is incredibly helpful. I hope it has answered a number of the questions that you may have. This time, however, we are now at the bulk of our meeting, and that is our question and answer session. We do understand that there may be some members of the media that have joined us this evening. We are going to ask that you please reach out and contact DTSC's Public Information Officer, that is Russ Edmondson, at 916-323-3372. We want to do our best this evening to share our project updates and welcome the questions from the community. I want to remind everyone there are 3 ways for you to ask questions this evening. The first is if you have joined us via telephone. I am going to read off the last 3 digits of your telephone number. When I do that, please press *6 to unmute yourself. State your name and ask your question. I will also ask that if you don't have a question at this time, please let us know and I will come back to you later in the meeting. Secondly, if you've joined us via Zoom, there are 2 ways for you to participate, and I see that we already have questions, both in the Q&A as well as hands raised. I have already jotted down the hands raised in order as they were presented. So, and they're still coming in. What I will do first, because we have only about 3 people participating via telephone, I'd like to go ahead and call on those via telephone to see if you have any questions, and then we will proceed with the Q&A, and then we'll go to our hands raised, and we will alternate throughout the rest of the meeting. First, caller with the last 3 digits 008. Again, if you are the caller with the last 3 digits 008, if you could please press *6 to unmute yourself. State your name, please ask your question. We heard you for a brief moment. Press *6. I see that you're muted again. Okay, caller 008, we will come back to you. We also have a caller with the last 3 digits 933. And the last 3 digits were 933. If you could please press *6 to unmute yourself, state your name and ask your question. Okay, callers, we are going to come back to you. I'm hoping you're not having any technical difficulty. We're going to rotate now to the questions that are in our Q&A. The first question, I believe, has been answered in Laura's presentation, and that indicates DOE, Boeing, and NASA have ignored the 2010 order and done minimal work since that time, if any. Why should we assume that the 2019 order will result in any different response? And I believe, Laura, you have already addressed that and indicating that the initial RMHF order on consent as well as the amendment both do follow the 2010 order on consent, that these are interim measures. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, but we will move that to the answered column.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Our next question, the Q&A, is when will ground cleanup occur? When will the groundwater occur? What is the timeline?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the cleanups will occur following a sequence of events, and I can give you an estimate on the timing. So it helps to understand what needs to occur and the estimate of timing, and Steve can step in as well on this. But as I discussed during the presentation, the above ground portions of the buildings are undergoing demolition, will be removed to slab on grade. The remaining part of the RCRA closure for the RCRA permitted buildings, that below ground portion will be removed because it's going to involve removal of structures below grade. For some of the buildings, that will involve some soil removal. So we have to wait until soil cleanup occurs to do the remainder of the ground and below grade structures. That cleanup will occur, both phases 2 and 3 needs to be occurring after the EIR is certified. We anticipate the certification of the EIR to occur in, say, early to mid 2021 of next year. But once the EIR gets certified, then the decision documents will be made available for the soils cleanup, as well as, and then the continued cleanup for phase 2 for completion of the below grade structures, as well as the adjacent soils, and also for backfill. So that's the time frame and the sequence for ground disturbing cleanup. As far as the groundwater cleanup occurring, some significant events have just occurred, and that is we've had DOE has issued its record of decision after completing its EIS, and that record of decision is for cleanup of groundwater. DTSC, we as the lead agency authority, we need to have our EIR completed and certified. And again, that could be early to mid next year. Once that's done, then the decision documents will be presented for public review and comment, as any decisions documents, whether they're for soil or groundwater cleanup. So the time frame we would look at in terms of as soon as the AR gets certified, that's a key milestone. And then the decision documents will take time because the public will have an opportunity to review for both ground disturbing cleanup as well as for groundwater cleanup.
Thank you so much, Laura. We have another question here in the Q&A. What assurance do we have that these interim measures will actually occur? Who is funding this cleanup, and what reporting will we have access to in order to ensure that this cleanup is progressing as expected?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So the interim measures are occurring. And in fact, the interim measures, the interim response actions required under the original order involving demolition of the RMHF structures, that demolition is complete. We're down to the last stage of demolition, and that is completion of the surface conditions in terms of sealing off the ground and the concrete and the vaults. So that will occur and probably be complete by the end of December. As far as the interim response measure for HWMF, that's in process right now. As I said, we've approved the plans, and DOE is anticipating demolition of the first of the two buildings starting next week. That completion should be the completion of that demolition for the HWMF buildings should be also done close to the end of the year. There remains completing of the cleanup for the remaining 6 buildings under the amendment. And again, that requires we need to first approve of the combined demolition plan and SOP. That could happen in the very near future. And then it's just a matter of them moving from the RMHF demolition over to the remaining buildings in Area 4 for those 6 buildings. As far as the reporting goes, we are submitting work notices describing where we're at in the process of demolition. We've done that throughout the RMHF demolition, and we've done that to notify folks of the HWMF demolition, and we'll continue to do that as we move through the completion of the HWMF and into the remaining DOE buildings in Area 4. So that's on our website. So please check in under the What's New webpage to look at the community updates that we're posting. We also post quarterly status reports from DTSC SSFL, and that includes Area 4's progress on cleanup efforts.
Thank you, Laura. We're going to have one more question out of the Q&A, and then we're going to go ahead and move to our raised hands. Thank you all for waiting so patiently. This last question, until we rotate again, is that DOE has released 4019 and 4029 for unrestricted use. Why is DOE now classifying, managing, and disposing of this decommissioned material as low-level radioactive waste? Secondly, DTSC and DOE acknowledge that buildings 4038, 4057, 4462, and 4463 have no radiological history. Why is DOE now classifying, managing, and disposing of debris from these buildings as low-level radioactive waste?
Okay, that's a very good question. I appreciate that, Phil. So buildings 4019
and 4029.
4029 for unrestricted use. I think to go back to this, we would go to the AOC. And in November of 2019, actually it was October of 2019, DTSC directed DOE to address all of the buildings in Area 4, regardless of who owned them or the RCRA status, in terms of telling DOE to essentially prepare standard operating procedures that will address how the buildings are to be demolished and the waste is to be managed and disposal actions are to occur. Those SOPs are to comply in every aspect to the requirements of the AOC. DTSC, we told DOE they can do one of two things in terms of complying with the AOC. Number one is they could characterize the building demolition debris And based on the characterization, and they characterize it to a radiological background standard. And in doing so, identifying any radiological contaminated debris must go to a licensed low-level radioactive waste facility. The other option we gave to DOE was, rather than negotiate around the characterization, just DOE could prepare an SOP that essentially just takes all the debris from these buildings in Area 4 and just disposes them to a low-level, a licensed or authorized low-level radioactive waste facility. Now, DOE has taken essentially both options here, and it has to do with the nature of the building's historical use. Some of the buildings, as I mentioned, have a history of radiologic use. Your first question addresses that. There are actually 4 buildings that have a history of radiologic use, and regardless of the status of release for unrestricted use, that history of radiologic use is sufficient enough to say that the waste could be characterized as low-level rad waste. So those buildings, DOE has opted for the 4 buildings have a history of radiologic use to go to a licensed low-level radioactive waste facility, and essentially a mixed low-level radioactive waste facility out of the state of California. As far as the buildings have a non-radiologic use, DOE has characterized the waste from those buildings. They're non-radiologic waste. However, there is hazardous waste remaining in those buildings. And as the hazardous waste is generated, there is a facility out of the state of California that is authorized to receive low-level radioactive waste, but also has a permitted hazardous waste landfill. That would be a RCRA or TSCA permitted landfill that can receive that waste. The specific types of waste we've been seeing coming out of the building demolition, a good example is asbestos containing materials. It's not uncommon during the course of deactivation and then demolition, as they're peeling apart the structures. Just recently, they came across, as they were going through the structures, they found some residual asbestos containing tiles in the flooring, and there's some mastic. And that building was building 4038. It's a non-rad building. Now, those asbestos containing materials, it's a potential hazardous waste. It has to go to a hazardous waste landfill. Now, not all hazardous waste landfills are authorized to receive asbestos containing materials. This facility in Idaho is authorized to receive asbestos containing materials in its hazardous waste landfill. And that landfill itself is a permitted landfill for RCRA and TSCA. That facility also, it happens to be authorized for receipt of low activity radioactive waste. This waste from these buildings, while it's not radiological, the extra added level of coverage by going to a facility that is engineered to receive low level waste, although the non-rad buildings waste is not radiological. It just means that you have a low-level facility that has that level of engineering to accommodate for low-level waste, although this waste is going according to the waste acceptance criteria for asbestos-containing materials to a landfill for hazardous waste that's authorized to receive the asbestos-containing material, and that landfill is properly permitted for RCRA as well as TSCA. I'm going on and on about all these terms, and I know there's confusion about authorization versus licensing. And it just gets to the point that these types of facilities are heavily regulated on the RAD side as well as on the hazardous waste side. So again, if a building had a history of radiologic use, it's going to a low-level radioactive waste facility that's licensed to receive that waste out of the state of California using the right paperwork, manifest for low-level radioactive waste, as well as uniform hazardous waste. If it's non-radiological, it's going to a properly permitted hazardous waste landfill at a facility that is authorized to receive low-level waste. However, the intent for this material is really as a hazardous waste. One other element I wanted to say is, by going to that facility in Idaho for the non-radiologic waste, there is an issue to think about, and that is in the characterization of the materials. We say it's non-radiological in that there was no radionuclides detected above its minimal detectable activity. So even though it's not detected, you still got to compare what kind of minimal detectable concentrations are being achieved during the characterization. sometimes due to the nature of the building materials, if you think of it as a detection limit, in a sense, the detection limits can be kind of high. Some materials like concrete can have components in it that could cause the results to be elevated. So it's not enough to say we didn't detect anything. We also need to look at, well, what was the level of detect? And DOE does that by looking at and comparing their minimal detectable concentrations to a surface contamination level. If minimum detectable concentration exceeds that threshold, then that acknowledges that there is some uncertainty, even though we're saying it's non-radiological. That detection is high. The non-detect at an elevated MDC is high enough so that by saying that we're putting this waste, it's going into a landfill that's authorized to receive low-level radioactive waste, even though it's not, but it's a way of acknowledging and addressing the uncertainties that occur with certain materials that might, for various reasons, have elevated radionuclides inherent in their materials. I know I'm rambling, and I apologize for that. I'm trying to clarify the difference between disposal of materials that have a history of radiologic use versus disposal of non-radiologic materials from buildings not having a history of radiologic use.
No, Laura, I think you've done an excellent job. That was a very detailed question from Mr. Rutherford. And I think you did an excellent job responding to that. So I hope that that has been very thorough for you, Mr. Rutherford. Now we're going to move on to the hands that are raised. Thank you very much. You all have been waiting patiently. And the first hand that went up was Mr. Dan Hirsch. So Mr. Hirsch, if you would ask your question, please.
Question is for Mr. Becker. Ms. Rainey has just disclosed that DTSC and DOE have broken the cleanup agreement, broken the law, and broken a promise that was made to me personally by the DTSC director. The AOC requires that the waste go to a licensed low-level or mixed waste site if it doesn't go to a DTSC facility. The Idaho facility, it has no license for low-level radioactive waste. It's operated by US Ecology, which tried to get a license to build such a site at Ward Valley, and I was instrumental in them not getting it. They are a hazardous waste facility that can take some very narrow categories of radioactive waste, but are not licensed to take low-level radioactive waste. You have broken both the law and the AOC, which require it to go to a licensed site. There is no such thing as an authorized commercial site. What are you going to do to now bring both DTSC and DOE into compliance with the law and the agreement that was signed in 2010 and the commitment that had been made by the DTSC director? The AOC bars waste going to the Idaho facility. It has no license for low-level radioactive waste. Mr. Becker, what are you going to do to fix this?
You're on mute, Steve.
You're on mute, Steve.
Sorry. Well, Mr. Hirsch, I certainly appreciate your input on that. What I can tell you is that the interim response orders that have been executed in conjunction and review by our executive staff. And we believe that the orders are in compliance with the AOCs. And if we need to have some sort of side discussion about that, we certainly can.
No, it shouldn't be side. Let's do it directly. The AOC says it has to go to a licensed site.
I'm sorry, there will not be any follow-up questions.
You allow a filibuster by Laura Rainey, but you will not allow any real discussion of the fundamental breach of the AOCs by DTSC.
There's one aspect of this to be made clear, and I probably did not make it clear enough, but the waste that's being disposed of at the Idaho facility is non-radiological.
Laura, that's not true. You just admitted that they didn't do the survey sufficient to determine if it was non-radiological.
No, I did not say that. DOE did a survey of the non-radiological buildings and determined there were no detected.
DOE did. Did DTSC sign off on those measurements?
Mr. Hirsch, excuse me, one moment. We heard the question. Please let Laura respond, and Steve has already given his response. We understand where you're going, and she is attempting to respond to the question. I will ask you one more time. Please do not ask the follow-up questions. We want to get to everyone who is here, and we will come back around. I will come back around during the course of the meeting. So if you can mute yourself now, and we're going to go ahead, and Laura, if you please continue with the response to the question. Thank you so much, Mr. Hirsch.
And I appreciate your multiple questions because it's so important, Dan, that from what you're saying, that people understand what we're saying. And that is, again, the waste coming from the buildings having a non-radiologic history have been surveyed and characterized as being non-radiological. There were no detected radionuclides in these building materials. So they're being disposed of as non-radiological. The AOC allows for disposal of non-radiological materials to a facility that it's non-radiological. What I've acknowledged is there could be some uncertainty. Sometimes you get results that have elevated minimum detectable concentrations, but it's not detect. So if it's not detect, there's no radionuclide contaminants detected in that waste, so it's non-radiological. It's still going to a facility in Idaho out of state instead of going in state to a hazardous waste facility. The benefit of it going to Idaho is it is actually authorized to receive certain types of low-level waste. And I believe, for example, the special materials exemption, but we're not even disposing, these materials are non-radiological. It's just that that facility is engineered to receive low-level types of radioactive waste as authority is granted to that facility. So the extra level of engineering for a facility that can accommodate certain types of low-level waste is an added benefit for waste that's non-radiological from Area 4 going to that facility, to a hazardous waste landfill that's fully permitted.
Thank you so much, Laura. At this time, we are going to go to the next hand that was raised. That's Ms. Christina Walsh. Ms. Walsh, if you could please ask your question.
Thank you. My question has to do with the statement about the groundwater intrusion in the RMHF buildings. The RMHF is essentially the hottest spot on the site, and there has been groundwater intrusion going back and forth for decades. So I wanted to have you clarify, are you saying that you're going to seal that? And then also, since these buildings were excluded from the EPA oversight investigation, are they certified to be empty, or what is the inventory as far as nuclear or hazardous chemical waste that might be stored inside those vaults? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. So the first question, when we talked about sealing against intrusion, this had to do with the surface conditions. So again, the buildings have been demolished to slab on grade. One of the buildings, building 4022 of RMHF, does have vaults, as Christina mentioned. Those vaults are sealed in terms of preventing surface water from intruding through the concrete cover into the vaults below. So we're not addressing groundwater at this point in those vaults.
But
This
there
is a
was
surface
existing
condition.
confirmed groundwater intrusion. So you're saying you're not addressing that?
Yeah, so that's a good question you're raising. That's not what we are doing right now. What we are doing is ensuring that the surface is completed so that no surface water will go down through the surface into the remaining structures that still need to be removed.
Thank you, Laura.
And
Thank
are
you
they
so much,
empty?
Christina.
And are they empty?
Yeah, so Christina had the second part I need to answer.
Go.
And I've confirmed with DOE that everything has been removed from the vaults. You can also look that up under the United States Environmental Protection Agency's historical site assessment. We have that on our website. We've posted. The structures that were in the vaults are no longer there, and they've all been removed.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Christina. This is just a reminder, everyone, as you ask your question, please be sure that you formulate it where it is a question. Please ask the question near the end to ensure that the presenters and or myself can answer it more effectively. And we are going to ask that you don't have follow-up questions as we move forward, because there are a number of hands raised and there are a number of Q&A questions that are coming in. We do want to get to as many questions as possible, and feel free to raise your hand again. At this time, I see that Councilmember Lavanos has joined us. Thank you so much. And Councilmember, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the time to talk. So I'm concerned about the difference between low level, you keep mentioning low level versus low level radioactive waste, and there is a difference. And, you know, our concern is, I understand that you stated that, you know, it's going to be sent out of state. And while that may seem to allay our fears or concerns, it doesn't allay my concerns, because I have multiple concerns. The first one being with the fact that, you know, we need to make sure that it goes to one of the 4 low-level radioactive waste commercial sites in the United States, or a DOE facility site. If you were going to abide by the true form of the AOC, then you wouldn't have changed the language, and you would make sure that you leave it the same place, because we don't want anyone to get cancer. I'm the council member. I am the represented elected official in Simi Valley that is dealing with yet another family member whose child has died of cancer. And I don't want anyone else to have to die of cancer due to exposure and due to the irresponsible, you know, removal of radioactive waste. So the language does concern me. I don't understand why the need to change language. And I do have a law degree, so I do know that language matters. My second concern is the same concern as that of, you know, the record of decision on the groundwater should not be made by the polluter, by DOE. It should be made by DTSC, whose mission is clearly very different in supporting the safety and health of residents of the state of California than DOE's mission is, which is to make sure that they are not held responsible. I am extremely concerned about the 84% of contaminated soil and all of the contaminated groundwater that continues to cause issues to people like myself, who I'm a cancer survivor. My daughter, who's had multiple teeth that have fallen out that I'm still paying for. And I'm
We have
tired
30 seconds, council member.
So if you can make sure that you answer these questions, I would like a fixed timeline for the groundwater remediation, for the soil remediation, and I would like to know why the language was changed from the AOC. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. To clarify again, the AOC is very clear that if you have radiologically contaminated waste, that is, you have any detectable radionuclides above the background standard, it must go to a licensed or authorized landfill following the disposal requirements that are in the AOC's agreement in principle. It's all laid out there. It's very clear. Radiologically contaminated waste must go to these facilities. What I've told you tonight is that we have radiologically contaminated waste going to a licensed low-level radioactive waste facility in Utah. It is happening. That's what's required by the AOC. I'm also telling you that there are buildings that don't have a radiologic history, and they've been characterized to a radiologic background standard and found to be non-radiological and consistent with the AOC. They do not have to go to a licensed or authorized low-level radioactive waste facility. It's the contaminated, the rad contaminated waste that does have to go. Now I'm confusing people because I'm saying that we're taking this non-radiological waste, it's not contaminated, but we're still having it sent to an authorized low-level waste, rad waste facility in Idaho. And I'm saying that that's happening because it's going out of state instead of in state, and it's going to a facility that's engineered to take certain types of low-level waste, even though this waste isn't radiological. It just adds an extra degree of protection, because ultimately we want to have full protection and be protective of human health and the environment. Your second comment had to do with the record of decision that DOE recently came out with groundwater. That's something that they actually have to do according to their NEPA process. They did their environmental impact statement. It was finalized. For every cleanup action, my understanding is they have to do a record of decision. They came out with a record of decision for the building demolition. They need to do that before they can proceed. But plans are developed after they do that. And we as the lead agency We are the lead authorizing approving agency. We review these plans and we must approve it before they can proceed. We did this under an interim response action for the building demolition. Now, you talked about the record of decision for groundwater. That's going to need a cleanup, and that cleanup must be addressed by DTSC under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, under our programmatic environmental impact report. We've come out with a draft. We're working on finalizing it, and the final EIR should come out, as I said, early to mid next year. That EIR must be certified first. Then the decision documents will be submitted. In this case, for groundwater, it would be a corrective measures implementation plan would be submitted by DOE for us to review, and under the lead agency approval, we must review and approve that before DOE can commence with groundwater cleanup. So what you're hearing is there's two processes going along. There's the federal process going that they have to follow, but there is the state process, and we are the lead agency and we are following it. So we very much are in control. The decisions that will ultimately be made are going to be with our ultimate approval as the lead agency.
Laura?
As far as you're concerned about the residuals remaining for whether it's soil or groundwater, a key point here is that we're talking about removal of RCRA permitted facilities. A closure of these facilities if we follow the completion of closure for RCRA facilities through the building demolition we're talking about tonight, followed by removal of the below grade facilities that is also described in the closure plan, which is then to be followed by removal of contaminated soils, and then followed there, and that would be under the AOC. And then if any contamination in groundwater, which there is at the site, would be followed under the 2007 consent order. The combination of all of these elements, once completed, will be an absolutely full and complete cleanup for both chemicals and radionuclides. And it should address your concerns.
Hey, Laura, I just wanted to add one thing on top of that, and that's that as far as the cleanup documents go, as Laura talked about, the record of decision is prepared under kind of a federal component. So there's the California component, which Laura spoke about, and that will involve the development of a cleanup plan, which will go through both public review and comment, which will be items that are considered by DTSC in whether a document gets approved. So while the record of decision is issued, that's the federal agency's way of saying this is what we'd like to do, but it still needs to go through the California process where it's subject to review and comment by both the public and the department.
Thank you very much. At this time, we're going to hear from Mr. Bowling, William Preston Bowling. If you could ask your question, please.
Okay, hi, thank you. Thank you, Laura, for answering these questions. I'm concerned that the buildings 4462 and 4463 at the SPTF are non-radiological. That's one of my concerns. And also, I'm concerned that the waste will not go to a licensed facility as per the AOC. Also, I was curious when they were saying that building 4022 was capped, and I thought that wasn't allowed. And how long is this cap going to be there before they actually do any type of characterization or even remediation on that? So that's the three things I have. Thank you.
Okay. So buildings 4462 and 4463, those are the sodium pump test facility and supporting facility. They're adjacent to each other. Those are considered, those buildings have a non-radiologic history, a history of non-radiologic use. DOE, as directed, did perform a radiologic survey and characterize those buildings to radiologic background values. There was no detection of radiologic contaminants as a result of the survey. So their findings were these are non-radiologic buildings. The debris from those buildings is being disposed of as non-radiologic, but it is going to a hazardous waste facility. That facility is properly permitted to receive the types of hazardous waste being generated. That facility is located out of the state of California in Idaho. And it happens that that facility also is authorized to read certain types of low-level radioactive waste. It's just that we are not just having this material disposed of as rad waste. It's going as non-radiologic waste. The AOC allows for disposal of non-radiologic waste to non-radiologic facilities. We're just out of an extra element of caution, DOE is taking this non-radiologic waste to a hazardous waste landfill that, in addition to meeting the needs for hazardous waste, is also authorized to address and engineered to take in low-level waste. But this is not low-level waste. So there's a subtle difference I'm really trying to make clear. It's just, it's going to the facility it needs to go to, but has an extra added element of protection. The other question you had to do with the nature of how we said building 4022 at RMHF, the surface was being completed to leave the site in its interim condition in a manner that's safe up until the time at which the remainder of the below grade and the surface and asphalt concrete needs to be removed. So it's going to be left with, we have the concrete slabs and asphalt in place. This building has vaults. The vaults need to be adequately covered and sealed so no surface water can get in and seep through the vaults. As a part of that, they are developing, they're building kind of like a roof type structure will go on top of building 22. The sole objective of that is to redirect any rainwater so that it does not go onto the footprint of the slab where the vaults are beneath. It's not, we're not capping the facility to leave waste in place. What it is we're leaving the surface at the end of this interim response action, and we're leaving it in a state in which it's safe and protective of the environment, the Area 4 environment, as well as the workers on site and the public. It's to keep that facility in its current condition in a manner that does not result in any intrusion into the vaults, because to allow for the time so that soil cleanup can occur, at which time the remainder of these underground structures would be removed. I hope I answered I know you had 3 issues, and I hope I answered them.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Laura. Now, as we move on, we're going to take 2 more of the hand-raised questions. After that, I'm going to go back to the telephone participants. Before doing so, I just want to let those of you who are adding questions into the Q&A know if your question is similar to one that has been answered during the raised hand discussion, or someone on the telephone has asked a similar question, we're going to move that to the answered area of the Q&A. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. We are now going to go to our next person with raised hands, and forgive me, this indicates a call-in user number 1. It says call-in user number 1. There is no name. If you're a call-in participant that came in that way, you can try *6 to unmute yourself, and you'll be able to ask your question as well. I do ask that you state your name.
All right, this is Dory Raskin.
Hi, Dory.
And one question I have is on leaving just the concrete slabs, aren't they contaminated? And then how are you going to clean that up?
Okay, thank you, Dory. Laura, if you'd like to take that, please.
Yeah, and Dory, yes, in some cases the concrete has some contamination that couldn't be removed, in which case from a radiologic perspective at the RMHF, the most contaminated building in terms of radiologic contamination was building 4021. There are a number of locations, I think 3 or 4 locations. They do a rad survey after they remove the building to see what's left on the slab. And in each of those locations, they found some elevated radioactivity. They placed a metal plate over each of those locations. And then in addition to that, they went and installed an asphalt on top of the entire portion of concrete slab where they had elevated radioactive measurements. The asphalt sufficiently covers the entire slab as well as portions of the foundation walls, anything that's shows elevated radiation. The idea is that there's to be no exposed elevated radiation on the surface for the duration until the remainder of the slab, asphalt, and the below grade structures are removed during future cleanup.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our next raised hand, and that is before we go back to our telephone participants. And this is from Melissa Bumstead. If you please ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. I just wanted to bring up that I've been working, researching the two buildings. Obviously, you know, my concern is that even if this goes to a site out of California, that's not great for me, because there is a Shoshone Nation right next to that, and they've had a long history of improper disposal by the Department of Energy, specifically of radioactive waste. So that in itself is not a huge comfort to me, because I believe we're all people and all deserve to be protected. But so according to a 2012 EPA site assessment by Greg Dempsey, that's the HSA Disc 4, or you could look at the HSA 5-A, page 58, building 4038, the EPA research team did not find evidence that high activity radioactive materials were used or stored. However, its oh my gosh, I cannot talk, I'm so tired. Its closeness to the RMHF may have resulted in direct radiation and sky shine. Also building 4057 from page 214, because the building was used as a research laboratory, there is a possibility that radioactive materials have been used. In addition, it's only 130 feet south of building 4059. Consequently, there's potential from other radionuclides associated. So what I'm trying to get to is Laura is saying that that these buildings are not contaminated, but we have evidence from the 2012 report. Has the DOE's report, was that authorized, looked over by the DTSC, was that done after this 2012 EPA report? And why is there that contradiction?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The first thing you said, I didn't quite catch. You mentioned two buildings going to a facility, and you mentioned the Shoshone Nation. So I'm not sure what two buildings, and I'm not sure what disposal facility you're referring to with the Shoshone Nation.
Oh, I can clarify. I'm sorry. I'm in both situations. I'm talking about building 4038 and 4057, and the Shoshone Nation is just right up in the same town as where that Idaho waste facility is. It's called Duck Valley Indian Reservation. So I was just saying, for reference, that it's going out of California to us is not in itself, it's not enough on itself. But my main question is about these two buildings, whether or not that the DOE report contradicts the 2012 EPA site assessment that Greg Dempsey worked on.
And so the EPA historical site assessment was very comprehensive. EPA looked at various pathways that radionuclides could have migrated and impacted, and almost all buildings in some manner, radionuclides could have potentially affected those buildings. And for that reason, EPA compiled all this information into what we call the HSA historical site assessment. That became the basis for their extensive soil sampling program in and around the various buildings. While that didn't include the buildings themselves, it included all the soil and the sediments in the areas throughout Area 4. Very comprehensive soil sampling efforts based in part on the historical site assessment findings. Now, you mentioned that a couple of these buildings, even though they had no history of radiologic use, they were, just from their very proximity, potentially impacted by nearby buildings that did have radiologic use. And that totally makes sense. And that is why those buildings had to undergo a radiologic survey. And that radiologic survey was completed by DOE to a radiologic background standard. And based on their findings, they did not see detects of background. They did not detect radiologic contaminants in the radiologic survey for those buildings. So
Could
their
you
basis.
share that document maybe in the chat or something, a link to it so that we could see that? Because obviously
Yeah.
that is the big concern about, verifying that study that they did. So would you be able to do that for me?
Yeah, they gave us a bunch of the radiologic surveys. I definitely, I can pull that up. I don't have it right now. I can't get it to you. It would take me a little while, but I should be able to post that online for you guys to see. So I'll make that available.
Laura, if you would like, if you just give that information to me and I can send an email blast to say that it's available online and we
Okay.
can place it in our What's New location.
Okay.
Thank you, Melissa, for your questions. Thank you, Laura. At this time, we are going to rotate again and move to our participants that have joined us via telephone. Again, I'm going to state the last 3 digits of your telephone number. I'm going to ask you to then press *6 to unmute yourself, state your name and ask your question. There is a participant with the last 3 numbers 933. Again, the last 3 digits of your phone number are 933. Please press *6 and state your name. Let us know if you have a question or if you don't have one at this time. Again, I'll try to come back to you if we have time in the meeting. Okay, at this time, there's one other telephone participant with the last 3 digits in their phone number of 155. Again, the last 3 digits are 155.
Hi, I have no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to get back to you before the end of the meeting. We're now going to move over to our Q&A. Thank you so much for being so patient. Our next question here, Martha Wade. Hi, how are you, Martha? You're indicating, will we get updates about this as this event is done? Yes, you will. As we did with the order on consent for the RMHF prior to the amendment, we will continue to provide work notices. If there's a need for a community meeting because we've had a milestone event, we will again have another community meeting like we're doing tonight. And if we have any decision-making documents that need to be addressed, we will have a public hearing for those purposes. So indeed, you will continue to be informed. Thank you so much, Martha. Next question from Brian. Will DTSC solicit, accept comments on their long-awaited EIR document?
I'll go ahead and take this one, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Brian. As everyone knows, the department is actively working on finalizing the EIR that went out in draft a couple of years ago. And basically, when it's reissued this time, it will be reissued as a final with anticipation of certifying it. So there really won't be much of the previous issuance of it was the time period to provide comments, and those have all been considered and addressed and will be presented within the EIR that is the final EIR that is issued. So just to be clear, everybody's comments have been considered, taken into account, addressed, and there will be responses provided for everybody's questions within the final PEIR, but there will not be any more review or commenting on it.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question in the Q&A is from an anonymous attendee, and it indicates what testing has been done to measure the effect of this nuclear incident on surrounding communities' groundwater and drinking water. So this quote unquote nuclear, it's indicated here, accident, incident, I believe they're referring to the one that has occurred some time ago before the existence of even DTSC. It's not specified here. but several tests have been conducted on site and early on near surrounding neighborhoods and communities. There is a plethora of information on the DTSC Santa Susana website. Please be sure to go to that. I can reassure you, we have done several tests that have indicated that contamination from the site is not leaving the site at levels that are at risk to human health and or the environment. So we continue to do that, and that's why we're continuing with our cleanup to ensure that we do protect human health and the environment. So I hope that's partially addressing your information. There are additional there's additional information as it relates to cancer studies, et cetera, all on our website. So I'm going to ask you, for the anonymous attendee, if you could give more specification and email me. I'm going to post my information at the close of the meeting in the wrap up. And if you were to email me, please, with a little bit more specificity, I will send to you the information directly that you may be looking for, okay? Now let's move on to the next Q&A. Also from an anonymous attendee, why is the waste being taken out of the state of California? Does California not have licensed, authorized sites that can receive them? Just wondering why this is becoming another state's problem.
I can answer that.
Thank you.
For a waste that's for buildings that are characterized to a radiologic background standard and no detectable radioactive contaminants are identified, and that debris from those buildings is deemed to be non-radiological hazardous waste. We do have facilities in the state of California that are licensed landfills, licensed for receipt of hazardous waste. They're RCRA and TSCA permitted landfills that can take that type of waste. There's been concern, given the history, the unique history of Area 4 and the past operations. Extensive community input has expressed concern that any debris coming out of Area 4 not go to a hazardous waste landfill in California, because none of them are licensed to receive low-level radioactive waste. That is why we said the non-radiological waste from the non-radiological buildings that have been characterized as non-rad waste is going to a hazardous waste landfill, but it's not going to a California one. It's, due to an abundance of caution, going out of state to the Idaho hazardous waste facility. And again, it has that extra level of engineering because it can take low types of low-level waste, even though this is non-radiological waste.
Thank you, Laura. We also have a few comments that are coming in the Q&A. We're going to move on. We are going to take note of your comments. We thank you very much. We want to make sure to address questions that are coming forward. Thank you, Diva. She says hello, or he. When did the DOE do the study on buildings 4038 and 4057? Did the DTSC do an independent test at these two buildings? These buildings had a past. These buildings had a past of radioactive activity, and I think you may have addressed quite a bit of this already, Laura.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The building the RAD survey plan goes back to several years, but I would say in the last 5 years or less, DOE has been conducting the RAD surveys. The files that we've been getting are no more than a few years old. We have a lot of files from their RAD surveys. DTSC has not conducted radiologic surveys. DOE does the radiologic surveys. The buildings had a past of radioactive activity. They are in Area 4, and Area 4 has had a past of radioactive activity. And that's why we've received so many comments about people expressing concern about debris from any buildings going to a California hazardous waste landfill. These buildings, though, don't have a history of radiologic use, although they are located in Area 4.
Thank you, Laura. The next question is actually a comment. We want to thank you, Brian. We're going to take a note of that comment. Gary, we see that your question has come back, and that is fine. It may have been similar, but we perhaps have not addressed everything that you wish to hear. His question is that conference, okay, we're going to skip that part. DOE has been monitoring groundwater for at least the last 30 years. Why can the DOE not perform the active remediation of all locations instead of using monitoring as the only solution for certain buildings / wells? And I do want to say that he prefaces this with DOE must adhere to the 2010 AOC. We have touched on elements, but Laura, if you want to touch on it.
Sure. The groundwater program is being dictated by the 2007 consent order for corrective action. The consent order focuses on chemical aspects of release. The AOC allows for radionuclides to be incorporated into that groundwater program that's dictated by the 2007 consent order. So we can and we will review the plans that address groundwater contamination for both rad and chemicals. DOE has identified there are 7 areas that do need remediation. The types of remediation range from active remediation at, I believe, 4 of the locations. 3 of the locations have shown decreasing concentrations of contaminants at or near their maximum contaminant levels, the drinking water standards. So the combination of seeing these contaminants are attenuating through time, and the data supports that, and they're very low to the drinking water standard. So DOE is proposing for those 3 out of 7 locations to monitor to ensure and confirm that those trends will continue. In all cases, they predict that the attenuation should reach to levels below the drinking water standard within 10 years. That's our snapshot in time, and that's being proposed. Nothing's been approved yet. But the other 4 areas of groundwater contamination identified by DOE will have various elements of active remediation. And some are rather extensive. The HMSA hazardous materials storage area has the highest volume of contaminated water. They'll be looking at, pump and treat considerations involving quite a bit of water. What do you do with that treated water? Need to look at that. Could there be some in situ ways to address that water? There's the FSDF, a groundwater interim measure has been in effect, that they've been pumping water and storing it on site for off-site disposal. That's removed a significant amount of VOCs, but there's still more to be removed, and they'll continue those efforts. There's a plume near one of the buildings, a PCE plume. They're going to install extraction wells, do pump and treat. There's a tritium plume in which we're seeing the tritium naturally decays. Data supports that and shows that decreases through time. Again, they anticipate that through the decay, it should achieve levels less than the drinking water standards. However, they do need to continue monitoring. They need to develop data and monitor it and support our conceptual model that it is decaying and attenuating, and that ultimately drinking water standards are achieved. There's one other location in a similar manner, very low decreasing trends for TCE near the metals clarifier, close to the MCL of 5 micrograms per liter. But they will have to monitor, it's a small area, they will have to monitor to demonstrate that continued attenuation is occurring at the location. For any one of these locations that they're monitoring for the attenuation, if the data is showing it's not attenuating, we need to go back and we need to come up with another strategy. So monitoring is a very important aspect. We're not just leaving it alone, we're actively looking at it, and data needs to be collected, and it needs to support that it is reaching its drinking water standard.
Thank you. We are going to continue with a couple more of the Q&A. I see we're at 7:30 and we have a number of hands that are coming up from participants that are here in the meeting that wish to speak as well. So we are going to have our next Q&A, which is from Brian. Has DTSC ever required the demolition debris of a non-radioactive building to be managed as radioactive waste at any other site? And that would, I don't think we could speak to all of the buildings that, well, DTSC, it's DTSC, excuse me, I think I said DOE, forgive me for that. Has DTSC ever required the demolition debris from a non-radioactive building to be managed as radioactive waste at any other site?
Steve?
Well, I mean, I'm not aware at this point. I don't have any knowledge of whether they have or haven't required those types of buildings to be sent, to the site. But what I will say is, we've provided clarification that out of an abundance of caution in this situation, that's what's being done. And so it's in an attempt to basically manage the waste more safely. I'm not saying that others haven't been managed safely, but as it was indicated earlier, it is out of an abundance of caution.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Brian, for that as well.
And I would point out that it's non-radioactive waste is being disposed of as non-radioactive waste. So hazardous waste from a non-radioactive building would go to a hazardous waste landfill in Idaho that happens to also be authorized to accept naturally occurring radioactive materials and special nuclear exempt materials. So it's not being managed necessarily as radioactive waste. It's being managed as hazardous waste under hazardous waste manifest to a hazardous waste landfill. And that's the norm. We do that. That's required, whether it goes to California or out of state. That's how you would manage hazardous waste. They're just DOE's taking that extra level of precaution, taking it to a facility that can accommodate radionuclides from natural occurring radioactive materials and certain exempt materials. So very low level materials.
Okay.
Michelle, could I go back and clarify on a previous answer or something? So
yes.
I spoke earlier about the fact that the NEPA process, the federal process, required DOE to issue a ROD. What I wanted to make clear that I forgot to acknowledge when I was discussing that was that DOE's ROD actually did talk about the fact that the final cleanup decision document would need to go through the CEQA process, and that would obviously be subject to California's process. So I just wanted to make sure it was clear that DOE and DTSC had discussed that, and that language was put in there to honor the fact that that needs to occur and acknowledge it.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to ask Diva your question about why was the DOE report kept from the public. There are several DOE reports relative to this topic, most of which are available on our website or in our Envirostar database. So please email me. Again, I will post that information and I can forward to you if you can be a little bit more specific when you email me whatever information it is you're looking for. At this time, because of the number of hands that we have that are here joining us today, we're going to move over to our participants with their hands up. The first person is actually listed as LGK30. So LGK30, I'm going to ask you to please state your name when you unmute yourself and ask your question. We can't hear you at this time. LGK30. If you are a telephone participant, you need to press *6.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you. Please state your name and
great.
ask.
Hello, it's Melissa Ospina. Good evening, everyone. I just want to go over just a couple things that I think they were gone over, but I have concerns about the disposal going to permitted but not licensed as to the AOC. That bothers me in Idaho because actually a girl that was born in Simi Valley in the Santa Susana Knolls moved to Idaho and works at one of those facilities. That's very bothersome there because we are just taking our problems somewhere else and creating a problem for other people. And as you know, my daughter had cancer and we lived below the facility on well water. So that's a very high concern to me. The slabs being covered up, what about the surrounding dirt around that? Until it does get cleaned up, what is going to be done about that? That's not going to be covered. Golden State Water, the runoff that's still going to be going down into approximately 33% of the homes in Simi Valley through Golden State Water, and most of the schools in Simi Valley are on Golden State Water. That's still of high concern, and why aren't those being monitored? And Laura, good evening, Laura. Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned a little while ago, full and complete cleanup. Are you saying that in the very end, it's going to be a 100% cleanup?
So Eva, I'm going to ask you to pause right there. You've asked several questions. And this last question you've asked, Laura. So there are two things I believe we're going to be able to respond to. Several of the others have been asked already. One
Okay,
is in
thank you.
relation to the concrete slab, and that I believe we have asked already, but I think we could go ahead and certainly put a lot of clarification there. As it relates to the groundwater in Simi Valley, we actually have a considerable amount of information available on our website about that. And in fact, we did a presentation in Simi Valley specifically regarding the groundwater there and Golden State Water. So I will also move that information and just make sure that it's available on the website in this location. I can also serve it as a link to individuals through our email blast as well, if that's an issue of concern. But I certainly want to get to our issues tonight from the presentation and answer those questions. So Laura, she did ask about the concrete slab and those protections there. She asked about runoff. I know that's more so in relation to stormwater, but if you could just speak to the concrete slab issue.
Yeah, I wrote a few things. One was just the concern about disposal to a facility that's permitted, not
Awesome.
licensed.
Mm-hmm.
Taking a problem from one place to someone else's place. And again, just to reiterate, non-radiological hazardous waste should go to an appropriately permitted hazardous waste landfill. In Idaho, they do have a RCRA and TSCA permitted hazardous waste landfill. It is appropriate to receive the type of waste being generated from the non-radiological buildings in Area 4. In terms of the licensing, there's different meanings to licenses. If you're talking about licensing from a radiological perspective, so that a facility that's licensed to receive low-level radioactive waste, such as the facility in Utah that is receiving debris from the radiologic buildings, that is not the Idaho facility. It's not licensed to receive Class A low-level radioactive waste, but we don't need it for this case because this is non-radiological hazardous waste. So it doesn't need a licensed low-level waste, but it does need a properly permitted hazardous waste landfill. In this case, it's RCRA and TSCA permitted, and it needs to be able to receive, as I was talking about, asbestos-containing materials.
Mm-hmm.
Not all landfills are authorized to receive that. This landfill is, and it has been. We have been seeing asbestos-containing materials going to that facility, and its waste acceptance criteria allows for it. The next item was how you're concerned about the adjacent soils where these buildings are coming out. What's happening with that? We're very concerned too, and that's part of why we're there in the field observing the activities for the building removal. We want to ensure there's no soil disturbance, and there is no soil disturbance for these above grade removals. And part of the work that's being done is to ensure that proper best management practices are in place so that surface water runoff will not cause any contaminants from activities to go out off the paved areas. And in addition to that, clean housekeeping is being done as a part of the demolition activities. So in every aspect, the efforts being made for above ground building demolition are being done in a manner that's protective of the surrounding soils, because those do need to undergo cleanup. They will undergo cleanup in the AOC. And that gets to your last question And again, to reiterate, we're talking about RCRA closure for RCRA permitted buildings. RCRA closure involves, number one, removal of the buildings and structures above grade and below grade. At the completion of that, and that's the RCRA closure plan that describes that, once that's completed, if there's any residual hazardous contaminants in the soils, that will be addressed under the AOC, and that requires cleanup to local background under the AOC. If any hazardous constituents from the RCRA facilities, residuals end up in groundwater, then that cleanup will occur under the 2007 consent order. When all is said and done, these cleanups from the building demolition and removal above and below grade, combined with the soils cleanup under the AOC, combined with the 2007 consent order for groundwater, when that's all said and done, we should be able to demonstrate that the RCRA cleanup closure performance standard has been achieved. And that is the point at which you can say that the cleanup is full and complete.
Okay, and I do want to say just two things. We are at 7:41. So we want to move through. If you believe your question as one that has already been asked, I'm going to ask that you refrain from that one and ask another question that you do want to hear the response to this evening. Secondly, in terms of presenters, when we respond, let's make sure we're succinct and we provide brief responses at this point. We want to get through as many questions as possible. And lastly, when we refer to full and or complete cleanup, please everyone, for clarification, that is cleanup being conducted according to our agreements. Okay, I just want to be very clear, being conducted according to our agreements. Our next person with the hand raised is Michaela Partington. Michaela, please ask your question.
The DTSC and Cal EPA have not issued anything enforcing the signed 2010 cleanup agreement. So I'm concerned with the neighboring communities. And what is the timeline when the full cleanup to the AOC 2010 and 2007 standards will be completed?
So your question is about the timeline on the 2010 AOC and the 2007
consent agreement.
order on consent.
What is the timeline for the full cleanup of the Santa Susana site per those agreements?
Steve, do you want to just touch on that briefly? We did respond to the PEIR and there are additional decision-making documents that we have to go through, but please.
Absolutely. So the once the PEIR is certified, then the department can begin accepting cleanup decision documents, which would be for both soil and groundwater, and putting those out for the public review and comment process. And then ultimately, after everything's been considered, approving those for implementation. Now, depending on what's identified as the technology and the areas to be cleaned up, that will determine the time frame that it takes to conduct the full cleanup. It's really tough to put an exact time frame. I mean, there's been references to like 15 years on that, but a lot of it's just going to be frankly dependent on what the final cleanup plans identify as far as areas go.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Michaela. Now we have Denise Dudfield. Hello, Denise. Oh, I see your hand. If you could ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have two questions and a little bit of a preface to them. I want to say that I find it incredibly disingenuous for DTSC and DOE to use the Woolsey fire as the reason for the building consent order, considering the effort that both DOE and DTSC put into denying that the Woolsey fire resulted in any increased risk to the community, despite solid evidence that it did, even in DTSC's own limited and inadequate testing that it had in its interim summary report on the fire. Also, Boeing, of course, reported 57 exceedances over pollution limits and stormwater runoff after the fire, which it admitted were due to the fire burning vegetation and making soil contaminants more mobile. So contaminated soil and the vegetation growing in it present just as much of a risk during wildfires as buildings do and year round. If DTSC really cared about the risk from SSFL contamination due to wildfire, it would uphold, enforce, and expedite the AOC soil cleanup, which it's not doing. Instead, you're using the wildfire risk to give the Trump administration what it wants, which is to demolish all the buildings and call it a cleanup, as well as political points so it can brag about how Trump's worked with California. And we're disappointed. We thought we might see some improvement in the Newsom administration, but this is the same DTSC we've always known, dishonest and letting the polluter call the shots. My two questions are, DOE's final EIR said it was going to break the AOC and leave most of the contaminated soil not cleaned up. What is DTSC doing about that? Will DTSC allow the polluter DOE to direct the soil cleanup as well? My second question is, when will DTSC complete its final report on the Woolsey fire?
I can tell you that the final report on the Woolsey fire has already been completed, Denise. There was an email blast that went out about that as well. So that is available on the Santa Susana. I'm sorry?
No, actually the Woolsey fire report has not been released final yet.
Oh,
No.
thank you. Thank you, Steve. My apologies. Okay. That was the interim report, forgive me. And that is still under consideration. Thank you for the clarification. And Steve, if you wouldn't mind handling Denise's first question.
Yeah, so was your first question, Denise, regarding DOE breaking the AOC? Is that what I understood it to be? Okay, you're on mute. You know, the department, as we've indicated several times before, based on both media inquiries and inquiries from the public and during other public meetings, you know, we are committed to enforcing the terms and agreements that we have with the various parties. And so, you know, we are committed to upholding the requirements of the AOCs.
How are you going to do that when its final?
I'm sorry, go ahead. Can you unmute Denise so she can speak? You're on mute right now, Denise.
Every time I try to, okay.
That's all right. There you go. You're good now. Okay, please go ahead.
DOE's final EIR said it was going to break the AOC and leave most of the contamination not cleaned up. What really will DTSC do to enforce the agreement and make them comply with it?
So we did touch upon this previously, but the DOE's final documents basically that they've issued to date are their federal process documents. So, you know, we still have to go through the California process, which involves CEQA and involves them submitting a decision document for both the public to review and comment on, as well as DTSC. So that is our opportunity to ensure that the terms and conditions of the AOC are enforced as far as final cleanup goes. What's been issued so far, as was discussed earlier, is really their requirements under the federal process.
But you really also are aware that they did not need to do that environmental impact statement. DTSC already told NASA they didn't need to do it because the AOC is an agreement, and it's
right.
You know, the EIS is triggered by NEPA, which is triggered when something is discretionary.
I understand.
So DTSC sort of playing along with that EIS is also a head scratcher and frustrating for us.
I respect your opinion on that, but what I will tell you is that we are committed to upholding the terms of the AOCs.
Thank you, Denise. Steve, thank you so much. And again, I do apologize. I do want to get in as many questions as possible right now. And again, Steve, thank you for the clarification on the final report. It is still under review, but we hopefully will get that out to you all soon. The next person with the hand raised is Jenny Knack. Jenny Knack, if you could please ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening. So I hear you saying that you're going to uphold the 2010 AOC agreements, but I've got, you know, I just printed out the EPA document, the HSA, where it's talking about building 4057, and because of its downhill proximity from where this that SNAP reactor was, that through just proximity, through water flow or airborne releases, the state's documents are saying that there could be radioactive contamination to these buildings. We're not talking about buildings that are, you know, miles apart from each other. When you showed the map in the beginning, all of these buildings should be going as the AOC promise that this community has fought for. This community, before I even moved here, fought long and hard to get that 2010 AOC agreement. And that AOC agreement said that these materials would either be sent to one licensed LLRW commercial sites or authorized DOE sites. And it's really hard to hear you say over and over again that the content, this material from these 4 buildings aren't radioactive when I'm sitting in front of a state EPA document that's saying that they are at risk of being radioactive. If we were going to be protective of public health, it seems that all of these materials should be going to licensed site or a DOE authorized site, because I hate to speak for the cleanup community as a whole, but we don't want this stuff going to anybody else's backyard. We want it done properly as this community fought for in that 2010 agreement. My other concern before I ask my question is, after reading DOE's—
And Jenny, you have about 30 seconds, so please get to the question.
Reading the DOE's groundwater ROD, where they're saying they're gonna, leave a lot of this to natural attenuation. My understanding is that the AOC promised everything to be cleaned up to background. We want to hear you saying that you are going to clean this up to background, not that you're going to send things to other communities. Can you tell us that you're willing to change your mind and send these materials to licensed sites or an authorized DOE site? Are you willing to say that you will make these responsible parties clean up to background? Because that's what we need to hear. And that's what we need to see.
I can provide a brief answer. Yeah. So again, the AOC is really clear that the buildings, and we told DOE they are to provide an SOP in that they shall characterize the buildings to a radiologic standard, and any characterized buildings that identify and detect radioactive contaminants above local background, they shall go to a licensed or authorized facility. That's straight out of the AOC. You're right. But what about the buildings that did get characterized that were determined to not have any detected radionuclides above local background? Those are considered non-radiological. The AOC allows for those to be disposed of according to their characterization. These are non-radiological buildings going as hazardous waste, following the characterization as hazardous waste to a hazardous waste landfill.
From the polluter.
No, the DOE is doing the RAD characterization. They are doing the RAD characterization. They're allowed to do that. We directed them to do that. The AOC expects them to do that, and their characterization is to be to local background standard, and they did that. They're following the AOC on that. They characterize those buildings. They're disposing of those buildings according to the characterization findings. And that's a really important point. If it's characterized as RAD, it should go to a licensed low-level RAD facility. If it's characterized as non-RAD, it does not have to go to a licensed low-level facility. It should go to a hazardous waste facility according to how it's characterized. Your next question about the record of decision for monitored natural attenuation, all of the groundwater work is being dictated by the 2007 consent order. And that entire program is derived under the consent order. The AOC allows for radionuclides to be considered into the groundwater program, but it's the 2000 consent order provides for the process of how groundwater will be cleaned up. So I just wanted to make sure you understood that important point. And there's many critical elements to the complex groundwater cleanup program, but please don't consider the AOC as driving the groundwater. It simply allows for the radionuclide contaminants to be incorporated into the site-wide corrective action under the 2007 consent order.
Thank you, Laura. We have a few people with hands still raised. There are only 2, however, that have not asked a question. I am going to call on you 2, and then we're going to move back to the Q&A and get as many questions in as possible. So Adam, if you could please ask your question, and then we'll move to one more individual. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah. Who is deciding what the process procedures are for sampling these buildings here, including the activity levels being set for monitoring radionuclides, and who's doing the sampling on these buildings? It sounds like the DOE is monitoring themselves. Is that true? And if so, can an outside agency who didn't cause much of this contamination and whose expertise is in radiation do independent sampling on these buildings?
The AOC refers to MARSIM, and MARSIM is what DOE is following. DTSC directed DOE to perform characterization. DOE is utilizing MARSIM as referenced in the AOC. MARSIM describes the protocol for doing building characterization.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Adam, for your questions. The last person here, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is Zamora Duran. Zamora?
Yeah, thank you, Xiomara Duran.
Xiomara.
Well, I really don't understand what makes these buildings non-radioactive waste when the soil around them, underneath them, are all considered radiological waste. Doesn't make much sense to me. And actually, the facility in Idaho is not low-level radiological waste, radioactive waste, and it's a hazardous waste facility, as has been mentioned, and it only takes naturally occurring radiological waste. So it would not be safe there. So why isn't the waste just sent to? I'm sorry, that's it. Just one question, I guess.
Please don't say anything. I'm right.
Okay, and with, sorry, go ahead, Laura. Were you about to respond?
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say that for Idaho, again, it's non-radiological waste is going to the Idaho facility. The Idaho facility is not a licensed low-level radioactive waste facility. We are sending non-radiological waste to the Idaho facility, to its hazardous waste landfill. And you're quite correct. It does receive naturally occurring radioactive materials at that facility. It's engineered to receive that type of waste, but the waste that's being sent from Santa Susana Area 4 is non-radiological waste.
Thank you so much, Laura. At this time, I'm going to ask that we move to the next slide. I am sorry that we weren't able to get all the questions that we have. This next slide provides my contact information. If you have additional questions or questions we weren't able to get through this evening, if you need additional information, remember I had to ask for some specificity from some of the questions that were in the Q&A. I am Michelle Banks-Ordone. Please email me. For those of you on the telephone, that is michelle.banks-ordone. That's ORDONE @dtsc.ca.gov. You can also, feel free to call me at 818-717-6573. If you are a member of the media that joined us this evening, again, please reach out to our public information officer. His name is Russ Edmondson. His email address is also available there on the screen. It is Russ, RUSS.Edmondson, EDMONDSON @dtsc.ca.gov. You can also reach him by telephone at 916-323-3372. There were some great questions that came to us tonight. Lastly, if you please click to the last slide. There is a meeting evaluation, and hopefully some of you attended both our meeting on June 11th as well as tonight. As you know, this was our first Zoom community webinar, and so we want to hear from you. This is the link and also a QR code there. Feel free, you can actually scan it, I believe, if you are on Zoom right now, and you can respond to the survey. I will also send this out via email blast. So if you are on our email list, you will receive this. If you are not, please do go to our website and sign up so I can ensure that you receive this. The evaluation will be up for the next week. Again, tonight's discussion, our meeting was recorded and it will be posted to our website. You do not have to explore our website. As soon as it is ready and it has been posted, I will again send out an email to let you know it has been posted to our website. And please feel free to review, or if there are questions you haven't asked, again, you can contact me via my email or phone number. We want to thank you so much again for joining us tonight, and we hope you have a great evening.